I'd like to welcome everybody to Sustainable Suppers. What we eat can change the world. No, really. This is something that really impressed me when I found out. So I hope that it will be interesting to you and something that you can use this Lent in order to gain a new spiritual practice that really will make a difference to others. Pope Francis tells us that everything is connected. And this is in Laudato Si, his encyclical on our care for our common home. Um, the Boston Catholic Climate Movement is sponsoring this event. And this is a group, I'm the chair of the group, so I'm glad to tell you about it. It's a group that is promoting Laudato Si living for individuals and also for parishes. We have events called Greening Your Parish events. We have a newsletter that comes every 2 weeks. If you're interested in that, at the very end, I'll give you my email address and you can send me a message asking for more information. So let's start with the prayer. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day this Lent. Help us to learn how we can better care for our brothers and sisters and all of creation in our common home. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. And this is adapted from a prayer in Laudato Si. Just by way of an agenda, we're doing this presentation during Lent. So this is a traditional time for thinking about food and cutting back on food. And I don't know about you, but when I was little, the idea was that it would instill discipline by not having meat or not having candy, whatever. But there really wasn't a reason beyond that. And maybe because when I was growing up, they didn't know anything about climate change. But now we do know about climate change, and we do know that there is a strong connection between what we eat and how much greenhouse gas we give off as a result of our eating. And that is the gas, of course, that causes climate change, causes global warming. So we're going to be talking a little bit about Laudato Si meets environmental science. Full disclosure, I'm a rewired science teacher. So I'm delighted that the Pope started his encyclical Laudato Si with the chapter on the science of what's happening in the environment. We'll talk a little bit about climate and diet, and then we have some guest presenters who will be talking about their own personal journey in moving towards a plant-based diet, a little bit on climate and food waste, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers and sort of next steps. So we mentioned Laudato Si earlier. This is the Pope's encyclical, which he writes to all in our common home, all people on the planet. This is so important because we all share this common home, and what we do to it really comes back to haunt us later. So we want to protect our common home because it includes a concern to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development, because we know that things can change. So that's kind of a hopeful note to say, because actually that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, is what we can do to make things change. And our goal is not to gain a lot of information, although you'll hear a lot of facts and figures, but it really is to sort of put the shoes of others on who are suffering from climate change and see what we can do to help. So we see some families who are suffering in Africa where there have been very severe droughts for very long periods of time. And there's so much in terms of losing occupations, agriculture. These folks are sitting in the middle of what looks like just a dry, barren area. In the back, you can see their homes, but no green vegetables, no plants, a little bit of one here. for them to eat. And so this is going to become an increasing problem as there are more and more droughts and areas of agriculture are not able to produce, especially since we have increasing population at the same time. We know that the floods are the other foot of climate change, that weather extremes are what is expected as the climate warms. And some of these extremes result in heavy monsoons, hurricanes, typhoons, etc. And you can see these poor folks are just trying to move through the water and save themselves, but do not have funds to move very far or reconstruct their houses. It's just a really bad situation. We know that 90% of those suffering the most from climate change have contributed the least to the problem. So this is a very serious thing, and it's not just in countries that are developing, but it's also here as well. We've had awful wildfires in our west. We are now in the middle of a very deep freeze in Texas with no power, etc. And there are some scientists that think that because the Arctic is becoming very unstable, it's warming a lot faster than every place else on Earth, that some of the weather patterns are dipping down and not being sort of restricted to the northern areas. And so we think that that's one reason why we are having such a big cold snap right now. Because what we do in the developed world is affecting people all over the planet, including those who can barely help themselves. We know that this is a moral issue, and it's something that we need to pay attention to, because the US is one of the largest polluters of the atmosphere in terms of climate. The Pope is asking us to recognize the need for changes in lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming. So here are the ways that are most common in terms of what causes climate emissions: how much you travel, how you live, what you eat, how much stuff you buy, and how much stuff you throw away. Now, I think most people are aware of the impact of cars and airplanes, and the fact that there is a variety of these things that you can choose, and you can choose some that have low emissions. How you live, you know that you need to turn your lights off, all of these things. But I didn't realize the impact of what you eat and how much you throw away have on the environment. There is a program called Drawdown, which involves hundreds of scientists and economists combing the records, combing the research for solutions to climate change. And so Drawdown is the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, which is kind of encouraging, because a lot of times we think there are no solutions, but they have discovered them and they've ranked them according to which is the most important. So they've listed the 100 best solutions to climate change, and they've represented them in these bubbles that you can see. The large orange ones have to do with electricity, and you can imagine shifting the production of electricity to renewables, solar and wind, will really help a lot, as well as increasing energy efficiency. And most of us are trying to be more efficient with our electricity, so that's a good thing. But some of us have solar panels, some of us don't. And I don't think very many people have wind turbines in their backyard. So this has limited use in terms of indicating what we can do to help somewhat. But look at this: food, agriculture, and land use. The second biggest bubble on this chart has to do with addressing waste and diets. And that's what we're talking about tonight, is how we can impact climate change by changing our diet. Also protecting ecosystems, and these things can go together. Now, these are all reducing sources. If you try to look for ways that can absorb carbon dioxide out of the air these are called sinks. They also have to do with food waste, not quite as much as on the diet, on the reducing the source front, but still there's some here. And then agricultural practices, by purchasing food that have been grown under conditions that allow carbon to be stored in the soil, that helps too. And we'll think about that a little bit later. So the theme is that we are looking at our carbon footprint to see how we might shrink it. And by changing how we eat, that will not be enough on its own to save the planet. But we can't save the planet without changing how we eat. So reducing greenhouse gases, the Pope says, requires honesty, courage, and responsibility, above all in the part of those countries which are more powerful and pollute the most. And that's us. So I'm going to play this video, which gives you a good idea of what you can do, and also emphasizes the fact that you do not have to completely eliminate meat from your diet to make a difference. You have a choice of how far you want to go in terms of moving to a plant-based diet, but everything helps.
I have to admit that when it comes to food, I'm a total sucker. Whether it's sugar or grease or carbs, pretty much bring it on. And I spend a lot of time in Montana. So for me, that medium rare grass-fed ribeye steak, pretty much as good as it gets. I know, I don't do it often. And when I do, I gotta admit, I feel a little conflicted. And that's for a lot of reasons, including the planet. But how big of a problem is what I eat? I mean, does it really make much of a dent in something as huge as global warming? It turns out what we put on our plates matters a lot. About 25% of all the global climate change problems we're seeing can be attributed back to the food and the choices that we're actually making about what we eat on a daily basis. This is greater than all the cars on the planet. In fact, it's about twice as much global warming pollution as the cars. Ben Holton and Maya Almaroz study the connection between climate and diet at the University of California, Davis. They track how the way we produce food creates greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. With their data, the team has crunched the numbers to figure out how much carbon pollution is produced by different foods and different diets.
A lot of people feel really helpless when it comes to climate change, like they can't make a difference. And what our research is showing is that your personal decisions really can have a big impact.
So take that grass-fed ribeye steak I love. If you really look at everything that went into making a single serving of beef, you end up emitting around 330 grams of carbon. That's like driving a car 3 miles. Now, if I choose to have chicken instead, there's more than a 5-fold drop in emissions. Switch to fish, and you see the number go down even more. Now, look at veggies. If I swapped beef out entirely for lentils, well, I'm down to practically nothing. So why does beef, and lamb too for that matter, pack such a powerful punch to the planet? Livestock accounts for a little over 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If that sort of seems low to you, consider it's about equal to transportation. We're talking all the cars, trucks, planes, trains, and ships on the planet combined. This is partly because ruminant animals like cows and sheep, they're just gassy. And the methane they produce is at least 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Plus, it takes a lot of land, fertilizer, and about 1 billion tons of grain to feed all that livestock.
And you could feed 3.5 billion people with that grain. If we were just directly eating these grains ourselves, it would eliminate a lot of the CO2 that's emitted from cattle production.
So it's clear that meat has a pretty big carbon load. But it's also worth remembering that not all livestock is raised equally. In parts of the American West, for instance, ranchers are working to raise livestock in ways that actually help restore the land. And they're experimenting with ways that soil and grasslands can be used to keep carbon pollution out of the air. But even these sustainable ranchers will really tell you we're probably eating too much meat. I know a lot of people who, if you don't serve them meat for lunch or dinner, they're kind of like, well, when is the meat coming out? It's to the point now where the US actually has one of the highest meat footprints per capita. So what about not eating meat at all? Vegan is the way to go for the least impact on the planet, but it's not that much different in terms of emissions than, say, a vegetarian diet. And the team found that the environmental impact of the Mediterranean diet is pretty similar to vegan and vegetarian diets. It's a lot less meat heavy than what Americans are used to. So fish and poultry a few times a week, beef maybe once a month, plenty of plant-based foods, and of course, loads of olive oil.
Eliminating like 90% of your meat intake is more important than eliminating all of your meat. We don't all have to be vegan. We don't all even have to be vegetarian. If we can just reduce our meat intake, every little bit helps. And if you can bring it down a lot, you can help the climate a lot.
If we all just switched to a Mediterranean diet, it could actually solve 15% of global warming pollution by 2050.
If everyone were to move toward it, that is equivalent to taking somewhere around 1 billion cars off of the streets in terms of vehicle emissions each year. So that kind of a footprint is big time.
But say you still want more meat than the Mediterranean diet recommends. Just cutting down your portion size to the doctor recommended 4 ounces can reduce your emissions by half. That's huge.
In fact, the doctors are telling us we're eating about twice as much meat as we really need for a healthy diet.
The good news is we are listening to our doctors. In the last decade, there's been a 19% drop in the amount of beef we eat.
All these things that you're already being told are good for you also happen to be good for the planet.
So what we eat really is a big part of the climate puzzle. I mean, we may not all be able to afford an electric car or putting solar panels on our house, but we all have to eat every day. And these choices we make can add up to really big numbers. And since meat has a pretty big carbon load, we need to be thoughtful about how much we eat. As for that ribeye steak that I really love, I am honestly trying to cut back. Maybe just a smaller piece of steak, or simply swapping out a meat dish for a veggie burger. It may seem like a small thing, but it really does add up to big impacts. Hey, so what did you have for dinner last night? Find out how your choices are affecting global warming by taking a quiz at climate.universityofcalifornia.edu, or watch one of our other episodes to discover what happened when I brought a box of donuts to MIT.
So I think we've heard from the video, a lot of things came at you pretty fast, but as much as a third of the greenhouse gases that human activity has added to the atmosphere, this is globally, can be attributed to modern agricultural methods. And about half of that has to do with raising animals, raising livestock. So just a quickie, I think you might remember that the gases that are generated by the raising livestock actually exceed the gases that come from transportation, from burning fossil fuels and transportation. Now, I think they mentioned that beef, of course, was the most impactful food in terms of greenhouse gases, and we'll talk a little bit later about why. But I think you can see on this graph that beef is the highest, and then as you go down the graph, you can see that other foods, especially plant-based foods, are much, much less than beef. But there are these little dots, and the red dots are the highest impact, the green dots are the lowest impact. And with beef, you can see there's a big difference. I think in the video, you saw that there are ways to raise beef on grassland by rotating the cows around, where you don't have as much impact on the climate. But look at all of the things that you might eat and just think about where they are on this chart. It talks about the kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per serving. So the higher the number on the greenhouse gas scale, the warmer the earth gets because of the production of that particular food. Now, it's not entirely obvious why cows are so much of a problem. And I should note that this one section on the left, which talks about greenhouse gas emissions from cattle, 32%, it's on the wrong end of the cow. It's actually cow burps that produce methane. Cows are ruminants and they have several stomachs. And one of the parts of the digestion process produces a gas called methane, otherwise known as natural gas. You may heat your home or have a stove with natural gas. It's the same stuff as methane. Methane, it turns out, is much more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide is. And in the short term, it's something like 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide is in terms of trapping heat. So that's a big problem if you add more and more methane to the environment. Some of the other parts of that have to do with cattle waste, manure. What do some of these big feedlots do with their manure? Because as it rots, it gives off methane gas. Another aspect is fertilizing. You saw, I think, in the movie, that production requires energy, and nitrogen fertilizers give off a gas that, again, is a greenhouse gas when they are applied to the soil. And then this is one that I hadn't thought about before, is 40% of the impact of the production of beef has to do with the fact that farmland or land is being used to raise crops to feed cows instead of being in its natural state. In its natural state, soil absorbs greenhouse gases, it absorbs carbon dioxide. And so some of that land is lost because it's put into agriculture to raise food for cows. So if you take 1.5 acres and you graze cows on this, you might produce 375 pounds of beef, but you could get 37,000 pounds of soybeans on the same acreage. So this is something to think about as climate change continues, because agriculture is going to be impacted. It's going to be harder to grow food. And at the same time, population on the earth is growing, human population. So we're going to have to feed more people. So we really are reaching a limit as far as how much meat we can continue to eat. This is something that really is surprising. Combining the land use for animal feed and actual grazing, here's grazing land, here's cropland that some of which is used to raise animal feed. It's a 41% of the US land area that's used to feed farm animals. Just think about that. It's really a huge number. Now, if we run out of land to feed animals in the United States, sometimes we just go elsewhere and let those animals feed elsewhere. And unfortunately, sometimes that happens in the rainforests of South America, where the rainforests in some places, I think a year or two ago, there was a change in the political scene in Brazil, and the new president allowed more of the burning of the rainforest to clear land. So here's the rainforest burning up, the land being cleared, and you can see the difference between the two areas. Not only is this harmful to what they call the lungs of the earth, the rainforest, but also think about all the plants and animals that will become extinct because of that. So that's another side difficulty in terms of getting rid of the rainforest, or really any area, in order to grow crops to feed cows. So they've calculated that 1/3 of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere since 1750 has come from deforestation. I think that in the United States, only 10% of our original forest remains. So we're really kind of doing ourselves out of a home when we are not aware of how our nutrition, how our food impacts the planet. Not only is it carbon dioxide, but it's also water that is required to make, for example, a hamburger. And I think it's something like the amount of water in 34 showers is what's necessary for one hamburger. And again, as climate change goes forward, we are going to have more and more problems with water, drinkable water. Julie is a person who is a vegan, and just as an experiment, she calculated her carbon footprint, which included her food, her shelter, her transportation, her stuff, her services, all of these things. And she plugged all that into her carbon footprint and found, to her dismay, that it would take 2.4 Earths to sustain her lifestyle as an American, but as a person who doesn't eat meat. She did exactly the same thing, except that she lied. And she said that she ate meat in a typical American way. And look at this, she would require 4.2 Earths in order to sustain her typical American lifestyle. So by changing your diet, you really can change the things that you need to survive. And even she, with her 2.4 Earths, needs to think a little bit about maybe how she can cut that back in the interests of justice. So I love this quote: weaving foods that protect creation into our diets is a way to love our neighbors, love that's needed now more than ever. Adding plant-based meals into our diets is an invitation to honor our Lenten tradition and stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers around the world. So this really makes our choices during Lent about our food, it broadens it out to a way to show our love for all of creation and also all of our brothers and sisters around the earth, especially those who are really feeling the impact of climate change. I love this quote from Wendell Berry: "To live, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it's a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it's a desecration. In such desecration, we condemn ourselves to spiritual and moral loneliness and others to want." So just to sort of bring this back full circle, that that choosing what you eat and choosing to eat less meat, more mindfully, is really a spiritual practice, and it could be a sacrament. So I'm going to put you into some breakout rooms, and here are some questions. I'm going to just sort of, oops, go back a little bit here. I'll read the questions. I'll try to put them in the chat while you're in your rooms, but I'd like to find out from you why you're interested in becoming more sustainable in your diet. Obviously you are, otherwise you wouldn't be here tonight. But what steps are you taking now? And what could you add for Lent and maybe beyond? And then what roadblocks do you anticipate in trying to change your diet? Also, what support do you need? And what support can you offer? Because we have some people among us who really have been trying to adopt a diet that's more plant-based. So can we hear some summaries from some groups?
Sure, I can start off. So in our group, I think everyone is ready to sort of try to eat more sustainably. One of our members in our group did mention that an obstacle would be that, you know, because she is not the cook of the house, it's her husband who is. And so it would mean trying to find challenges to find really simple, straightforward recipes that would make it easy for him to get on board with the diet change, which
Right.
I think Fran will be sharing some resources for that.
Yes, I share that issue as well.
You know,
So,
if you don't tell people that something is meatless, like a different kind of soup or a stew or whatever, and if you don't bring it up, and if it's really seasoned well and all the rest of it, they don't have to know that it's meatless, you know?
right, sneak it in. Can we hear from another group?
Well, in my group, a couple of things I noticed. I mean, people talked about, this was Colin, Jennifer, Barbara, and I mentioned giving up meat, but some of the things that help are that people have adult children or older teenagers who are more vegetarian or they're interested in eating that way. And then another thing that came up is ethnic foods, like, you know, thinking it isn't a meal without potatoes, but you can substitute a vegetable or vegetables, or you know, you feel you want pasta, but you can find some substitutes. and some of the help, like when I asked the question, well, what about support that you'd like us, people are relying on other family members who are more into eating more vegetables and in a vegetarian or vegan way.
Great, thank you. How about another group?
In my group, we talked a lot. There's definitely like a lot of willingness, and everyone seems like they're already trying to eat more vegetarian or plant-based. But what people talked about was helpful was just also keeping like your options open and trying new things, like remembering that there are vegetarian or like meatless or there's dairy-free cheese options and milk options and stuff like that. And also just like researching and finding like ways that you can eat chocolate that isn't necessarily like so harmful for the environment.
Great, thank you. We have one more group, I think. Do we?
Yeah, we talked about food, and I mentioned the fact that fair trade chocolate from Singing Rooster is some of the most environmentally sound chocolate and coffee that you could possibly get. I also talked a little bit about using seasonings. People think sometimes if you don't have meat that it's going to taste bland, but there's all kinds of seasonings and other things that you can put in. People aren't even going to know that the meat isn't there.
Mhm.
It's only when you call attention to it, because most people around the world can't afford meat. And when you go in different countries and you eat the food of the country, there's no meat there. And you don't think anything of it because there are beans, there are other sources of protein and so on that they grow. So it's, instead of talking about food without meat, focus on food with blank kind of thing. So they don't focus on the without part.
Good, thank you. Well, a lot of good tips here. And we do have two experts among us here who can tell us a little bit about their decision, how they made the decision to move to a more plant-based diet, and also any tips that they have that they can offer. And I think they've already offered some. But Hien, why don't you go first, and then Catherine, Hien Wen is a member of Sacred Heart Parish in Lexington, and she's very involved with zero waste and started her own nonprofit that focuses on that. But Hien, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey and any advice you have in addition to what we've talked about?
Yes. So about 4 years ago, I decided that I would, obviously I was reading lots of articles about how eating meat was not sustainable, and it just felt right to me at the time that it was time to make a change in what I was eating. And so I started it, and so I'm in a household. I have my husband and I have 2 young kids. And at the time, I was the only one who was doing this. My husband and children were still eating meat. And I did this for about 6 months. And I think initially it felt a little bit challenging. And so then I sort of stepped back a little bit. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to be not vegan, but I'll be pescatarian. So I'll still eat fish occasionally. I'll still eat eggs here or there. And then I think one day we had guests over from out of town, and then I decided, okay, well, if I'm going to eat meat, I'm going to eat grass-fed, organic filet mignon, And there's one week where I served that for dinner, like 2 nights in the week. And after the second time, my husband was just like, I'm done eating meat. I don't want to eat meat anymore. He's like, I'm going to become vegetarian. And so when he said that, I thought, all right, well, now that he's on board, then I'm going to go back to being vegan. And so since then, that's what we've been doing. And for me, like a big reason why I have continued with it is because in my own family, for example, I have my oldest brother has type 2 diabetes and has had it for about 20 years and just did not manage it very well. And I have to be honest that I did not know that much about type 2 diabetes until about 3 years ago, when it got so bad that he ended up needing to get his lower limbs amputated. And so that was when I started really doing a lot of research into type 2 diabetes and learning more about what contributes to it and how it's preventable. And ultimately what I learned is that so much of our health is related to what we eat. And I'm just a really strong believer in the philosophy that it starts with healthy individuals, and healthy individuals equals healthy communities equals a healthy planet. That the way we eat is good for us, but it's also, and the more healthy individuals you have in a community, you can have thriving communities, and then that just expands out, and that's good for all living kind on the planet, not just human beings, but all living beings. And I think in terms of any challenges that I feel like an easy way to approach it, especially what Sister Ruth was saying about how, like, when you serve certain things, like, don't even say it's not me, you know? And so, like, for example, with my daughter, she, like, we'll make tacos, and instead of using ground turkey or which I used to do, I just would get extra firm tofu and break it up, and I would just prepare it the same way I would prepare ground turkey, and I put all the fixings out, and she wouldn't be any the wiser. And she's just like, yum, you know? I find that when I tell her that something is an
And it's the problem.
alternative, her reaction is, no, I don't want it. But if I don't tell her and just give it to her, she'll eat it and she'll be like, yum. So I think that at the beginning, I did a lot of that. Like, you know, I would still serve sort of traditional, like when I made lasagna, for example, instead of doing it with ground turkey, I would do crumbled tofu. And you can do things like there are non-dairy cheese alternatives that you can use. I try not to really, like, for me, I just would rather not use the substitutes, but I think that that is a way for you to get on board.
Exactly.
And once you're on board, then you can sort of focus more on whole plant foods.
Right. Thank you, Ian. That's great. And Ian was kind enough to provide a number of resources, and Catherine did as well, which are in quite an extensive resource list. And at the end, I'll give you the link to that, and I will send it to you as a follow-up as well. So Catherine, can you tell us something about what happened with you and how you decided to move towards being plant-based?
Yeah, so I became vegetarian, I think it was about 3 years ago now. I don't exactly know what pushed me to do it. I just we'd been learning a lot about like climate change in school, and I also had a bunch of friends who were vegetarian either for religious or like health reasons. So between the combination of all of that, I finally was kind of just realized like it would be better for the environment if I did it. And also there were just so many dinners that I would come home and just I didn't really care for like the meat at dinner, so I realized it would be an easy shift for me to make. So I did that. I agree, the first 6 months or so can be kind of difficult, especially because like so many people do eat meat like around me. So at first, like making sure I always had like an option of something to eat can be kind of difficult. But I had a friend that went vegetarian with me at the same time. So that was really helpful and also fun because we would share recipes and like try stuff out together. And we even went vegan 2 weeks together, and that was a very difficult 2 weeks, but I'm glad I tried it. And I would like to try to go more vegan in the future. I don't know if I will ever go fully vegan, but my parents and my sister still eat meat. So it's just kind of me at home that's vegetarian, but I've been slowly getting them to try more vegetarian recipes. And similarly to what some other people have been saying, if you don't tell them that there's no meat, like my family doesn't care at all. They just like will tell me if it's good or bad and enjoy it regardless. And I think they've kind of been warming up to the idea of being vegetarian. My sister and my dad really enjoy eating meat, so I don't know if they'll ever go fully vegetarian, but I convinced them to go vegetarian for Lent, and it's already been a long 2 days with them. My sister was even telling me yesterday, no, today at like lunchtime, she's like, it's been a whole like I think 30 hours and she was already complaining. I'm like, come on. But they're trying. And we've also had a lot of enjoyment, especially in the beginning. Now I've kind of figured out like what I like to eat and what works for me on a vegetarian diet. But especially in the beginning, we had a lot of fun trying like new recipes, and we tried tofu and like dairy alternatives and all that. And I agree, I tend to stay away from like the fake cheeses and stuff, but it was still fun to try, and I'm glad that I did try it at least once. But yeah, it's a lot of small, especially for my family. It was easy for me to just like completely give up meat all at once, but for my family, the small changes and making it less of like a daunting big like that we need to make this life change, and more of just a way to like experiment with what you're eating and try out like new foods. And a lot of the vegetarian recipes again are like just as delicious, if not like more delicious than a lot of meat recipes. So
Yeah.
good way
Thank
to
you.
approach it.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So it seems like both of our experts here have sort of eased into it. And I think that's something that we can all sort of take our cue from. So one of the other things that we need to think about in terms of our food consumption is what happens to that food when we're finished with it. In fact, it would be good to think about what happens to the food before it reaches us. Because we know in the world, about 30% of the food that is grown, processed, and transported will go to waste. In the US, as you can imagine, 40% of food, it's really an outrageous figure. We know that some of the problem is that food can be spoiled as it's grown on the field, is not picked in time. Some of it as it's transported is damaged. Some of it doesn't quite meet our perfection standards. It has a little bruise here or there and it gets thrown away because of that. But a lot of the food that comes to our table actually is thrown away because we don't take care of it. We decide that we don't want leftovers, or it sits in the back of our refrigerator for a few weeks and gets green fuzz on the top, and it gets thrown out. And this is really, as the Pope says, whenever food is thrown out, it's as if it were stolen from the table of the poor. It means that our decision making is not taking into account the fact that others are hungry while we throw our food out. In fact, if we could only save 15% of our food waste, it would be enough to feed 25 million Americans. We know now there are even more hungry Americans that could use that food. So it really is good if we can be mindful of the idea of food waste. And to that end, the Ignatian Carbon Challenge, which is something that's happening this Lent, the Lenten Food Waste Fast is happening. You can sign up for it. And if you look in our resource list, and you'll have a link to that at the very end, you'll be able to see how you can participate. This week's suggestion is to look in your refrigerator and use everything that is still good. Make some soups or create some casseroles, whatever. Use everything that's good, all the leftovers. And then anything that has spoiled, remember the green fuzz, that stuff either gets thrown out or it goes into something that we're going to talk about in 1 minute. When you throw food out, it's really taking it off the tables of the poor. And here's a little more information about the Ignatian Food Waste Fast. It's saying reducing food waste could have nearly the same impact on reducing emissions over the next 30 years as onshore wind turbines. So that's amazing. I think it turns out that the amount of food that's wasted, the gas that's generated, because most of that will be buried in a landfill, it will produce methane, which I think we mentioned before, is a very powerful greenhouse gas, in addition to carbon dioxide, that's much more powerful. And that gas, if it were a country, the gas that's generated from food waste would be like the third most significant polluter in terms of greenhouse gases. That's amazing, just from rotten food, basically. And here it is. What happens if you throw it away? Here's your garbage bag, and typically 21% of the items in the garbage bag would be food scraps. So there's a better thing that you can do with food scraps, and it's called composting. So I think a lot of people have heard about this. Some of you do composting. Some of you pay someone to come and pick up your compostables. I won't spend too long looking at the steps for composting, but it's pretty simple. And it really is, makes a big difference in terms of how much you throw away at the curb, and also the kind of good, rich soil that is produced that you can use in your garden or in your lawn. There are many benefits to composting, and one that I just want to highlight is that composting actually protects the climate. If you throw compostable food away and it gets buried in a landfill away from oxygen, it actually generates methane, which is, I think we mentioned before, it's natural gas, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So this is a big problem. But if you have a backyard composting situation where your compostables are exposed to oxygen, that is when it will be turned into really good soil, good and rich soil. And when that compost is supplied to the land, that can actually absorb carbon. So it's a good way to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And it just says, when research projects show that 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent over 3 years can be absorbed by just a ½ inch of compost applied to rangeland. So it really is impactful. In addition, we know that we know that climate change is going to happen and it's going to get worse. And one of the outcomes is heavier downpours in the Northeast. I think they've increased something like 70% in the past 50 years. And if you have soil that has compost in it, it acts more like a sponge to hold that water in rather than to have it, sort of move over the land and fill up your basement. So compost is really helpful in diverting some of the worst problems from climate change. Also, it filters out pollutants, so that's a good thing too. So a lot of advantages to composting. Here's an example in our parish where our green team got the people who were planning the St. Patrick's Day party to move towards compostable plates, cups, and food, of course, and as a result of their celebration. And so we helped them to decide where to put their trash when they were finished. And you can see the bag of all items that were compostable. And we did have a professional composter that came and picked that up. These would not go into your backyard composter. But look at the little single bag of trash that has to be burned in the incinerator, which is where we send our trash in Lexington, compared to what can be composted and changed back into good soil. So it really is effective, and it's even more helpful if you try to do this in a larger group. So we are hoping that as a result of living more simply, moving towards a more plant-based diet, that others may more simply live. Here's some examples of sort of a mantra you can think of. You've heard of some of these, but some of these you haven't. So the first one is rethink, which is what we're doing now. So that's a good thing. And the rest you've heard, perhaps not refuse, but that's the first thing. Reduce, reuse, repair, recycle, and then regenerate is what we were just talking about, which is really rot in the composting. And then the next one I really like because we need to add this one, and that is react. So you make your own personal choices, but Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org, says that the best thing an individual can do to fight for climate change is to join a group. So there are lots of opportunities for you to reach out once you've made that choice to change your diet, is to see how that can be applied in other areas. Here's an example of our friend Catherine from Weston High School, who got together with her friends of like mind, and they're almost ready to convince their school committee that they would go to a year of meatless Mondays. And so they calculated the savings of actually doing that in their school. So they're trying to promote this in school. I know some schools always have a meatless choice, so that's really good. But to actually go ahead and make that the main choice for people, that's a good education. You know that during Lent, you've heard of the rice bowl. I think some of you have those at home. And this year, we're suggesting that you take the $3 per person per meal, or per meatless meal, that you would save, and then try to find a way to spend that or donate it. Whoops. Try to find a way to donate that to a cause that would help people who have been impacted by climate change. So for example, recently there have been some really tough hurricanes, 2 within a couple of weeks in Honduras, and it's had such an awful impact that many people are leaving their homes and moving north again because they just cannot make a living on their land. And unfortunately, previous to the hurricane, some of them haven't been able to make a living because of drought. So these extreme weather situations are really trying for people who are living close to the land and really don't have the means to move or change or, adapt. So there are many options for donating money, and one of them is to Catholic Relief Services, which is really good. But then also there are some others that I'll send you in a follow-up message. Nothing wrong with getting together for food justice. And now, pretty soon, there will be a bill that will be proposed at the State House that's called Food Justice with Jobs. And this is something that would increase access to locally grown food for low-income residents. Many of our low-income areas, the only place people have conveniently to buy food is small convenience stores, and they don't have a wide selection of fruits and vegetables. Potato chips, yes, but good, decent food, no. So this act would help to improve access to locally grown food. And speaking of that, don't forget your farmers markets and the CSA choices that you might be able to make to get fresh vegetables. This is choosing your own farm share. Those tomatoes look good. And then finally, why change your diet? Well, just to say it briefly, this is Father Emmett Farrell, who said, "We are all brothers and sisters living in one house, AKA our common home, and we need to take care of each other." And I would just extend the brothers and sisters part to human and non-human brothers and sisters as well, because we know that we rely on other animals and plants and soil and air and water in order to survive. So in order to protect life, we need to protect everything that sustains life in all of our ecosystems as part of our care for our common home. And I end with these two little cuties here who happen to be my grandchildren, because that's one of my big motivations in doing this work, not just for them, but for all grandchildren in the future. So it's not just generations now that we need to think about, but providing a livable home for all in the future as well. So thank you very much for coming tonight. And as never before in history, Common Destiny beckons us to seek a new beginning. Let ours be the time remembered for the awakening of a new reverence for life, the firm resolve to achieve sustainability, the quickening of struggle for justice and peace, and the joyful celebration of life. So let's leave on a joyful celebration of life note. And I'm leaving you with my email address, and also a link to our Sustainable Suppers resource list, which you should be getting by email as well. But I encourage you to write. Thank you very much.